Welcome to the Irish Exit Everything 2023 recap. Time flies when you're living in a dystopia, and if you haven't been checking the time lately, the Doomsday clock was moved to 90 seconds to midnight. That's an indicator of how much closer we are to annihilation. And this isn't really a surprise because every day this year felt like Doomsday for working people. And we're going off the rails on a Norfolk Southern train. You know, with homelessness reaching record levels, over 650,000 people in the US, as rent prices remain near record highs, which is what happens when housing is treated as a commodity. As absurd as it is that we have to pay for healthcare out of pocket at all, our insurance premiums keep going up, and it's expected to reach a record high next year, which is especially troubling since millions of people have been kicked off Medicaid. The number of people going hungry is on the rise, over 26 million people in the US going without food because we can't afford groceries, and there's been an unacceptable rolling back of assistance. And food insecurity will likely only get worse thanks to climate change, which is impossible to ignore at this point. It was the hottest year on record, which contributed to the deadliest US wildfire in more than a century. And if it's not a raging inferno we have to worry about, it's destructive flooding, because record high levels of carbon dioxide will continue to trap heat in the atmosphere, adding more moisture in the air, which is then all dumped on us like a waterfall. This is fourth grade science. Yet despite this new reality of global boiling, Biden approved the Willow Project, announced auctions for more oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, and refuses to declare a climate emergency, because that would be bad for fossil fuel business. The Human Rights Campaign, on the other hand, has declared a state of emergency for the LGBTQ community in the US, because there's been hundreds of anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced this year, with 75 of those bills being enacted into law. Unfortunately, the tragedies don't end there. Mass shootings have also reached a new record number, and we can't expect the police to protect us. In fact, the number of people killed by police keeps trending up, according to mappingpoliceviolence.org, including Tortuguita, who was peacefully organizing against the construction of Cop City. But that's on brand for the criminal justice system, from the cops to the courts. Speaking of which, the ultra-conservative, unethical Supreme Court continues to do everything in their judicial power to shit on working-class people, from attacking our right to strike, to trashing affirmative action and student loan cancellation, although many folks haven't been paying that shit back. They also limited water protection and water access, particularly for indigenous people. The very few decent decisions they made, upholding the Indian Child Welfare Act and the Voting Rights Act, were truly the bare minimum. I guess that's more that could be said about the dysfunctional US Congress. Far-right Republicans kicked off the year by holding Congress hostage by delaying the House Speaker race, which at least brought us this iconic moment of Representative Mike Rogers fixing to throw hands. The 15 rounds of voting it took to elect Kevin McCarthy was pretty much all for nothing though, because for the first time in US history, the House of Representatives eventually voted to oust him. But not before he made a deal to raise the debt ceiling to $31.4 trillion. A deal that Biden didn't even need to entertain, which basically restricts and cuts spending, except for the military, adds new work requirements for SNAP benefits, and protects tax breaks for the wealthy. And they'll pick up this unnecessary debate again in 2025. That's not the only deadline Congress keeps kicking down the road. The fight over the federal budget brought us to the brink of a government shutdown a couple different times this year. First in September with McCarthy, then in November with Mike Johnson, who was leading a bipartisan death panel to cut social benefits. A preview of heartless things to come early next year. But Congress and Biden, of course, had no problem passing an $886 billion defense spending bill, which is about 3% more than last year's military budget. They gotta keep the war machine chugging along to protect profits, not people, even if they can't or won't say for sure where that money's being spent. Whether it's in Ukraine, where the US would rather send tanks than diplomats, or in Palestine, where the US has been sending military aid to the Israeli government for decades. The conflict didn't begin on October 7th, and it really doesn't matter how complicated the history is. Anyone can look at the current siege on Gaza and see a genocidal program of collective punishment, where the indiscriminate bombing has tragically brought the death toll to over 20,000 in just 2 months. But working people around the world recognize this and are saying enough is enough. Activists in the US are shutting down streets and bridges in the DNC headquarters, clashing with police as they call for a ceasefire in Gaza and an end to American aid to Israel. Boycotts have been an especially useful tactic against Starbucks, McDonald's, and others. And in a movement of solidarity, labor unions are joining the call for a ceasefire, including the UAW, who recently won a major victory with their historic stand-up strike. And they weren't the only union who flexed their muscles this year. We saw the largest healthcare strike in US history. We saw LA teachers and staff shut down the second largest school district in the country. We saw striking hospitality workers tussle with hotel security, and we saw the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA take on Hollywood and win. Whenever we're reflecting on the year and on recent events, it's easy to feel as if we're doomed. But we cannot immobilize ourselves into complacency and apathy. Together, in collective action, march, protest, boycott, strike, we can prevent doomsday. Together, we can mitigate and reverse the climate crisis. Together, we can defend our bodily autonomy. Together, we can fight for freedom of movement. Together, we can bring an end to war and genocide. Together, we can feed and house and educate and care for everyone. As the oceans keep rising in 2024, let's make sure we lift all boats. Unless it's a yacht or an OceanGate submersible in a video game. Thanks for listening, and it's time to exit 2023. See you next year.